For 40 years, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps operated under a single foundational assumption that shaped every strategic decision emanating from their headquarters in Tehran. They believed, with absolute certainty, that no foreign power would ever cross the threshold of direct kinetic engagement against their core operational infrastructure. They believed that the threat of asymmetric retaliation, the threat of proxy mobilization across 7 theaters simultaneously, the threat of closing the Strait of Hormuz and detonating global energy markets would forever serve as the impenetrable shield behind which their terror apparatus could operate with structural impunity. That assumption has just collapsed. And it has collapsed in a way that nobody, not the analysts at Langley, not the strategic planners at the Pentagon, not even the intelligence officers inside the IRGC's own Quds force, anticipated would arrive this fast or hit this hard. Something massive has entered the theater. Something that operates outside every framework Tehran built its deterrence calculus around. Something that does not respond to the threats that have kept the IRGC untouchable for 4 decades. And the trap that Hossein Salami, the IRGC commander, personally designed to draw this new entrant into a controllable engagement zone, has not just failed. It has reversed, it has turned. It has become the mechanism through which the entire Iranian forward projection apparatus is being systematically dismantled in real time, in ways that will not be undone by any negotiation, any ceasefire, any diplomatic maneuver currently being prepared in the marbled halls of the Foreign Ministry on Imam Khomeini Avenue. Read those words carefully. The trap that the IRGC built to ensnare a superior force has become the cage in which their own command structure is now trapped. The very geography they weaponized has become the geography weaponizing them. The very proxies they cultivated as expendable forward shields have become the intelligence vectors through which their entire network is being mapped, exposed, and eliminated with surgical precision that defense analysts are calling the most effective counter-terror campaign since the elimination of the ISIS caliphate. And the full weight of what just happened has not yet landed on Tehran. It has not yet landed on the strategic community in Washington. It has not yet landed on the energy markets that will be reshaped by what comes next. But it is landing now. Stay with this analysis carefully, because what is about to be explained is not theoretical, not speculative, not the kind of geopolitical projection that fills mainstream commentary. This is the architecture of an operational reality that is unfolding at this exact moment across 4 separate theaters of engagement. This is the mechanism by which a 40-year-old terror infrastructure is being structurally dismantled. And this is the story of how the IRGC's most sophisticated strategic trap, the one designed by men who studied American vulnerabilities for decades, became the instrument of their own catastrophic exposure. To understand the magnitude of what has just shifted, the foundation must be laid carefully. The IRGC was never a conventional military organization. It was constructed in 1979 as a parallel apparatus designed specifically to operate outside the constraints that govern state armed forces. Its mandate was not territorial defense. Its mandate was the export of revolutionary ideology through asymmetric means. And over 4 decades, it built what intelligence analysts at the Defense Intelligence Agency described in classified assessments as the most sophisticated proxy network ever constructed by a state actor in the modern era. That network was not improvised. It was engineered with patient strategic discipline across generations. Hezbollah in Lebanon, with its precision missile arsenal exceeding 150,000 projectiles before recent attrition. The Houthi movement in Yemen, transformed from a tribal insurgency into a force capable of striking commercial shipping at the Bab el-Mandeb choke point. The Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, embedded within the official security apparatus while answering to commanders in Tehran. Kataib Hezbollah, Asaib Ahl al-Haq, Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, each operating as franchise extensions of the same central command. The Fatimiyun Brigade, composed of Afghan Shia fighters. The Zainabiyun Brigade, composed of Pakistani recruits. Together, this constellation of forces gave the IRGC what Qasem Soleimani himself described as strategic depth across the entire region, a phrase that meant the regime could absorb direct strikes on Iranian soil because retaliation could be projected through proxies positioned in 7 different countries simultaneously. The foundation of this entire architecture rested on one critical operational premise. That premise stated that Western powers, particularly the United States, would never sustain a kinetic campaign aggressive enough to dismantle the network because the cost of doing so would trigger consequences too severe for any administration to absorb politically. Energy market disruption, allied casualties, domestic political backlash, escalation toward great power confrontation. These were the deterrence pillars that kept the IRGC's forward apparatus operationally sacred for 40 consecutive years through 6 American administrations spanning radically different ideological orientations. But here is what Tehran failed to understand about the architecture they built. Every system contains hidden vulnerabilities that emerge only when stressed beyond design parameters. And the IRGC's network was designed for an adversary that would respond conventionally. An adversary bound by traditional rules of engagement. An adversary forced to deploy carrier strike groups and air wings and ground forces whose movements could be tracked, whose logistics could be targeted, whose political sustainability could be eroded through patient asymmetric pressure. That adversary was the assumed shape of any threat the network would face. That adversary is not what just entered the theater. What entered is something that operates outside every parameter the IRGC's strategic planners built their architecture around. It does not arrive on aircraft carriers that can be tracked across satellite imagery. It does not deploy ground forces whose casualties can be exploited through information warfare. It does not depend on political authorization cycles that can be disrupted through congressional pressure or media manipulation. It is distributed, persistent, and operates on timelines that compress traditional military planning into hours rather than months. And it has demonstrated in the past 72 hours capabilities that have rewritten the strategic calculus for every actor in the region. The mechanism of this new entry can now be examined directly. The mechanism was assembled quietly across the past 18 months through what defense officials described as the integration framework, a coordinated effort to fuse autonomous strike platforms, real-time intelligence fusion centers in Bahrain and Cyprus, signals intelligence collection from forward-deployed assets, and human intelligence networks that had been patiently cultivated inside the very proxy organizations the IRGC believed it controlled. The integration framework was not announced. It was not debated in policy journals. It was constructed in operational silence while Tehran focused on what it believed were the critical threats: carrier movements, B-2 deployments, special operations activity in northern Syria. The mechanism's first operational deployment came at 3:14 in the morning local time, when a coordinated wave of autonomous strike platforms, operating with no human pilots and minimal radio emissions, penetrated airspace over 3 separate IRGC-affiliated facilities simultaneously. The first facility was a Quds Force logistics hub in southern Syria that had been routing weapons shipments to Lebanon for 11 years. The second was a drone manufacturing complex in western Iraq that had produced the Shahed-class platforms Russia subsequently deployed against Ukrainian infrastructure. The third was a maritime command node on Iran's southern coast that coordinated the small boat swarming tactics the IRGC Navy had rehearsed against American shipping for 2 decades. All 3 facilities ceased to exist within a window of 17 minutes. The strikes were precise, surgical, and accompanied by no announcement, no claim of responsibility, no diplomatic notification. They simply happened. And then, in the hours that followed, additional strikes began materializing against secondary nodes that the IRGC had assumed were too obscure to be on any target list. A communications relay outside Damascus. A financial transfer hub in Beirut's southern suburbs. A weapons transit facility on the Iraqi border. Each strike demonstrated the same operational signature: autonomous platforms, surgical precision, complete silence in the aftermath. The scope of what this represents extends far beyond the immediate kinetic effects, and this is where the analysis must expand to capture the full structural consequence of what has unfolded. The strikes themselves are not the strategic story. The strategic story is what the strikes proved. They proved that the integration framework can identify, track, and eliminate IRGC infrastructure with timelines that compress from months to minutes. They proved that the human intelligence penetration of proxy networks is far deeper than Tehran ever suspected, because target selection at this precision requires sources operating inside the organizations being struck. They proved that the political authorization cycle that traditionally constrained American responses has been replaced with something faster, something distributed, something that does not require the deliberation patterns the IRGC built its timing assumptions around. And this is where the trap that Salami designed enters the analysis with full clarity. Because Salami's trap was elegant, and on paper it should have worked. The trap was constructed to draw any aggressive American response into a narrow geographic corridor where the IRGC's asymmetric advantages would dominate. The corridor ran from the Strait of Hormuz through the southern Persian Gulf and up into the maritime approaches near Bandar Abbas. Within that corridor, the IRGC had positioned anti-ship missile batteries, small boat swarming flotillas, mining capabilities, and shore-based radar systems designed to overwhelm any conventional naval task force operating within the geographic constraints. The trap depended on one fundamental assumption. That assumption stated that any American response would be conventional, would require carrier-based air power operating within range of the Iranian coast, and would therefore have to enter the corridor where the IRGC's asymmetric advantages compounded against the inherent vulnerabilities of large surface combatants operating in confined waters. Salami had spent 8 years personally refining the corridor's defensive architecture. He had run dozens of exercises rehearsing the swarming tactics. He had positioned Russian-supplied Bastion P coastal defense systems and Chinese-supplied surveillance assets along the entire shoreline. He had built what he believed was an inescapable killing zone that would impose costs severe enough to deter any kinetic response before it could fully materialize. Major revelation? The integration framework simply bypassed the corridor entirely. The autonomous platforms that conducted the opening strikes did not approach from carrier-based launch points. They did not require sustained presence within the IRGC's defensive bubble. They originated from forward-deployed positions in geographies the IRGC had not even classified as relevant threat vectors. Some launched from mobile platforms in the eastern Mediterranean. Some originated from positions in the Gulf of Oman, outside the corridor's geographic boundaries. Some came from locations that have not been disclosed, and that intelligence officials describe in terms suggesting the launch architecture itself represents a new operational paradigm whose details remain classified. The trap, in other words, was built to constrain a force that no longer needed to be constrained. The killing zone Salami designed across 8 years became operationally irrelevant within 72 hours of the integration framework's first deployment. And the consequences of that irrelevance are now cascading through every layer of the IRGC's strategic architecture in ways that will not be reversed by any conceivable countermove. The complications that prevent any simple resolution of this situation are now multiplying with structural force across multiple domains simultaneously, and the depth of those complications must be examined carefully because they reveal that what is happening is not a single tactical reversal, but a comprehensive systemic crisis that threatens the foundational logic of the regime's survival strategy. The first complication exists inside the IRGC itself, where the chain of command is fracturing along lines that have been suppressed for years, but are now becoming operationally visible to anyone reading the signals correctly. Hossein Salami, who personally designed the failed corridor strategy, is reportedly facing internal questioning that has not been seen at the senior IRGC levels since the aftermath of the Soleimani assassination in January 2020. According to multiple intelligence assessments, Esmail Khani, who commands the Quds Force, has begun positioning his organization as operationally distinct from the conventional IRGC structure, attempting to insulate the proxy network apparatus from the catastrophic credibility collapse Salami's failure has triggered. This positioning is not coordination. It is the early signature of an institutional civil war inside the very organization that exists to project Iranian power externally. The second complication concerns Ali Khamenei himself, the supreme leader, whose health has been the subject of persistent intelligence reporting for 18 months and whose succession framework has never been resolved with operational clarity. Khamenei built his domestic legitimacy on the foundation that the IRGC's external apparatus made the regime structurally invulnerable to foreign pressure. That foundation is now visibly cracking in ways that domestic Iranian audiences can observe, even through the heavily filtered information environment the regime maintains. When the foundation cracks publicly, the legitimacy that rested on it becomes negotiable. And when legitimacy becomes negotiable inside an authoritarian system that has spent 40 years insisting that its legitimacy is non-negotiable, the entire succession question reopens with consequences that nobody, including Khamenei's own family network, can fully control. The third complication operates in the proxy theater. Hezbollah's leadership, already operating under the catastrophic attrition of the past 18 months, is now facing the existential question of whether continued alignment with Tehran is sustainable when Tehran can no longer guarantee the strategic shield that justified the alignment in the first place. Naim Qassem, who succeeded Hassan Nasrallah, inherited a position whose entire operational logic depended on Iranian support that was assumed to be uninterruptible. That assumption has been falsified in real time. The Houthi leadership in Sana'a faces the same calculation. The Iraqi militia commanders, several of whom have already begun quietly pursuing back-channel communications with Baghdad's central authorities, are recalculating their alignment in ways that will fragment the network from within rather than requiring external dismantlement. The fourth complication is economic, and its severity is approaching catastrophic thresholds that the regime's economic planners had modeled but not believed would actually materialize. Iranian oil exports, which had reached approximately 1.6 million barrels per day through the gray market arrangements with Chinese refineries, are now under pressure from a combination of factors that compound rather than alternate. The maritime insurance market has begun reclassifying Iranian origin shipments at risk premiums that make the economics marginal even for the Chinese teapot refineries that have absorbed most of the export volume. The financial transfer apparatus that processed payments through layers of front companies in Hong Kong, Dubai, and Kuala Lumpur is being mapped with the same precision as the kinetic targets, and the financial nodes are being designated faster than the network can reconstitute alternatives. The fifth complication exists in the domestic Iranian information environment, where the regime's narrative monopoly is failing in ways that have not been seen since the protests of November 2019. Persian-language broadcasts originating from outside Iran are now reaching audiences inside the country with detail and timeliness that the regime cannot match through its own messaging. The young demographic that drove the 2022 protests is observing the strategic collapse with attention that the Security Ministry's surveillance apparatus is having difficulty classifying as either passive consumption or active organizing. The Basij, the paramilitary force that has historically enforced street-level compliance during periods of unrest, is reportedly experiencing recruitment difficulties in provincial centers where economic conditions have deteriorated below subsistence thresholds. These five complications are not sequential. They are simultaneous. They are compounding. They are operating across domains that the regime's crisis management architecture was never designed to address in parallel. And they are doing so on a timeline that compresses traditional regime adaptation cycles into windows that may not allow coherent response before structural damage becomes irreversible. What comes next is where the analysis must move, and it must move with the recognition that the situation is not stabilized, will not stabilize on the current trajectory, and is approaching a series of decision points whose outcomes will be determined in rooms where men whose names appear in classified intelligence reporting are choosing between paths that will define the Middle East for the next generation. The first decision point concerns the IRGC's response architecture. Tehran has options, but each option carries costs that compound the existing crisis rather than resolving it. The first option is escalation through the surviving proxy network, attempting to demonstrate that the strategic shield retains operational relevance even after the kinetic exposure of the past 72 hours. This option requires activating capabilities that have been held in reserve for exactly this contingency, including the precision strike platforms that Hezbollah retains in hardened positions in the Bekaa Valley and the cruise missile inventory that the Houthi command has dispersed across cave complexes in northern Yemen. Activating these capabilities, however, requires accepting that they will be exposed, mapped, and likely eliminated in the response cycle that follows, depleting the inventory the network was meant to preserve as a deterrent reserve. The final complication, and the one that intelligence analysts describe as the variable nobody can model with confidence, is the question of what Vladimir, what Xi, and what Mohammed bin Salman are calculating as they observe the IRGC's apparatus being systematically exposed. Each of these actors had assumed that the Iranian shield provided a regional buffer that constrained American freedom of action in ways that benefited their own strategic positioning. Each of them is now recalibrating that assumption in real time. Russia, already overextended in Ukraine and unable to provide meaningful support to Tehran beyond rhetorical solidarity, is watching its only Middle Eastern client lose the deterrent capability that made the partnership strategically valuable. Beijing, which depends on Iranian oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz to maintain its energy security architecture, is calculating whether continued alignment with Tehran has become more costly than the alternative of accommodating American demands in exchange for stability in the energy corridor. Mohammed bin Salman, in Riyadh, is making the most consequential calculation of his career. The Saudi crown prince had pursued a tentative normalization framework with Tehran across the past 2 years, mediated through Beijing, that was designed to insulate Saudi Arabia from the costs of regional confrontation. That framework was built on the assumption that Iran retained the capability to impose costs severe enough to justify accommodation. With that capability now visibly degraded, the Saudi calculation shifts toward whether the normalization framework remains necessary or whether the moment has arrived to accelerate the regional realignment that ties Saudi security architecture more directly to American capabilities in exchange for the economic and technological benefits the partnership provides. The second option for Tehran is acceleration of the nuclear program toward a breakout threshold that would force the international community to negotiate from a position recognizing Iranian capability rather than demanding its elimination. This option carries the benefit of restoring the deterrent architecture through a different mechanism, but it carries the catastrophic risk of triggering the exact kinetic response against the nuclear infrastructure that Tehran has spent 20 years attempting to deter. The integration framework that just demonstrated its capability against the proxy network can demonstrate equivalent capability against centrifuge cascades at Natanz, the underground facility at Fordo, and the heavy water reactor at Iraq. The threshold for that demonstration is closer than Tehran's nuclear planners have publicly acknowledged. The third option is negotiation, but negotiation from a position so structurally weakened that the terms will resemble surrender more than diplomacy. Masoud Pezeshkian, the president, has reportedly authorized back-channel communications through Omani intermediaries that suggest Tehran is exploring what the framework of accommodation might look like. Those communications are being conducted without Khamenei's full endorsement, which means they carry no operational authority, which means they may be repudiated at any moment by a supreme leader whose own legitimacy crisis makes accommodation politically catastrophic for his domestic position. The negotiations exist in a strange operational limbo where they are real enough to be tracked, but not real enough to produce binding outcomes. The integration framework continues operating. The autonomous platforms continue identifying targets. The intelligence fusion centers continue mapping the financial and logistical apparatus that connects the surviving nodes of the proxy network. Every hour that passes without a Tehran response that demonstrates operational relevance is an hour during which the strategic shield erodes further, the proxy alignment fragments more deeply, and the domestic legitimacy that rested on the shield's existence becomes more visibly negotiable. The clock that the regime has spent 40 years insisting could not run against it is running now, and it is running in ways that cannot be reset by any move currently within Tehran's operational capability. The questions that remain open are the questions whose answers will determine how this unfolds across the coming weeks. Will Salami survive the internal pressure that his catastrophic strategic failure has generated, or will Khani's positioning succeed in absorbing the IRGC's effective operational authority into the Quds force apparatus that has not yet been publicly associated with the failure? Will Khamenei, whose health remains the subject of persistent reporting that the regime cannot effectively counter, make a succession decision that consolidates power in his son Mojtaba, or will the institutional fractures that the crisis has exposed produce a succession contest that the regime's architecture cannot contain? Will Hezbollah's command structure decide that survival requires distance from Tehran, or will Naim Qassem accept that the organization's existence depends on a relationship that no longer provides the protection it once guaranteed? Will the integration framework, having demonstrated its capability against the proxy network, expand its operational scope to include the nuclear infrastructure that represents the regime's last remaining strategic asset? The decision makers whose calculations determine that question are operating in rooms whose conversations are not being recorded, but whose outcomes will be observable in the operational signatures that emerge across the coming days. Will Beijing, which has invested 2 decades in cultivating the Iranian relationship as a counterweight to American regional dominance, accept that the relationship has become a strategic liability rather than an asset, or will she authorize support that risks direct confrontation with the integration framework's underlying capabilities? Will Mohammed bin Salman accelerate the realignment that the regional moment has opened, or will he hedge in ways that preserve optionality at the cost of strategic clarity? Will Vladimir, whose Ukrainian campaign continues consuming the resources that might otherwise support his Middle Eastern client, write off the Iranian relationship as an unaffordable commitment, or will he attempt some asymmetric intervention that complicates the operational picture without genuinely altering its trajectory? Each of these questions has an answer that is being determined right now in deliberations whose participants do not know that the decisions they make in the next 7 to 10 days will shape the regional order for the next 15 years. The trap that Hossein Salami designed to crush any aggressive response against the IRGC's apparatus has produced the opposite of its intended effect with structural completeness. The corridor that was meant to be inescapable has become irrelevant. The proxy network that was meant to provide strategic depth is fragmenting into actors whose individual survival calculations no longer align with Tehran's central command requirements. The deterrent architecture that operated as the foundation of regime security for 40 consecutive years has revealed itself, in 72 hours of integrated kinetic and intelligence operations, to be structurally obsolete against an adversary that operates outside the parameters its design assumed. What enters the theater next, what Tehran chooses to do in response, what the regional actors calculate as they observe the architecture failing, what the integration framework expands to cover as its operational tempo continues, are the variables whose intersection will produce the next phase of the unfolding crisis. The Strait of Hormuz remains open. The proxy network continues operating, though at degraded capacity that compounds daily. The IRGC continues issuing public statements that maintain the rhetorical posture of strategic confidence even as the operational reality diverges further from the rhetoric with every passing hour. The Supreme Leader has not appeared publicly in 5 days, which is the longest such absence since the period preceding his most recent medical procedure. The Quds Force has reportedly relocated its central command coordination to a facility whose location has not been disclosed even within the broader IRGC structure, suggesting that internal compartmentalization has been imposed at levels not previously seen. Hezbollah has issued no operational statements regarding potential escalation, which represents the longest such silence since the organization's founding and which signals deliberation at levels of the command structure that historically respond to provocations within hours. The Houthi command in Sana'a has temporarily suspended its anti-shipping operations in the Bab el-Mandeb, citing what its spokesman described as a strategic review, language that the organization has not previously employed in any public communication. Each of these signals individually could be interpreted as routine adjustment. Together, they constitute the operational signature of a network in the early stages of comprehensive realignment. The realignment will not be announced. It will not be visible in any single dramatic moment. It will be visible in the accumulating absence of capabilities that the network previously demonstrated, in the financial flows that no longer reach the destinations they previously serviced, in the proxy actors who no longer respond to the central command tempo with the alignment they previously displayed, in the regional partners who no longer treat the relationship as the strategic asset it previously represented. Something massive entered the theater. The trap designed to contain it has reversed against the architects who built it. The terror apparatus that operated with structural impunity for 4 decades is being dismantled in real time through mechanisms whose full operational scope remains classified. And the consequences of what has unfolded in the past 72 hours are still expanding outward across military, economic, diplomatic, and psychological domains simultaneously, in ways that will not be reversed by any move currently visible to any actor in the regional system. The clock is running. The decisions are being made. The architecture is collapsing in the direction that its designers never imagined possible. And the next phase, the phase that determines whether the regime survives in recognizable form or undergoes the structural transformation that 40 years of forward projection was meant to prevent, is being written in the choices that men in Tehran, in Beirut, in Sana'a, in Beijing, in Moscow, and in Riyadh make in the coming days. Those choices are being tracked. Those choices will produce consequences. And the story of how those consequences unfold is the story this analysis will continue tracking as the next moves materialize in the operational reality that has just been fundamentally and irreversibly transformed.